Hello, this is Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it'd be fun to combine the two. Well, the Olympics are almost over, and from a very young age, I've always enjoyed the games. Being a history and geography nerd, I always thought it was so cool that all of the countries of the world would come together and play different games, and I love seeing all the flags from the different countries competing. So, in celebration for the Olympic Games, I thought it would be fun in today's episode to go way back in time and talk about the original Olympic Games that took place in ancient Greece and rebuild some structures that those original games took place in. Before I jump right into placing blocks and building the structures, let's set the stage for when the Olympic Games took place. Now, I just said that the original Olympics took place in ancient Greece, but at that time, Greece wasn't a country as we know it today. Rather, at that time, being Greek, or as they would refer to themselves as Hellenes, was a collection of independent city-states that were ever competing and vying for power and influence over one another, and were a shared culture and belief systems for the people who lived in those areas around the modern country of Greece. Examples of these city-states were places like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and a whole bunch more. The Olympic Games were part of the Panhellenic Games, which were religious festivals held in different places throughout Greece. These Panhellenic Games consisted of 4 festivals, each of which were held every 4 years. In other words, a span of time called an Olympiad, but staggered, so each one of the festivals was held on each year. Only Greeks were allowed to participate in these games, thus the Panhellenic Games, and during the Olympic Games, a truce was universally declared to cease hostilities or any conflicts or wars during those events, and Greeks were allowed to travel, in theory, to and from the games through what normally would be potentially a rival city-state's territory. Just like in our modern age in the Olympics, back then as well, the Olympic Games were used as a proxy to show political rivals and show how one's country or city-state is superior to one another. I mean, look how much time in the modern Olympic Games they spend talking about who's higher or lower in the different medal count. Same thing back then, although they didn't have medals. I'll get into that a bit later. So what were these Panhellenic Games? One of them was the Pythian Games, which took place in Delphi in honor of Apollo. And yes, that's the same Delphi that had the oracle. The Pythian Games were established around 582 BC and continued through till the 4th century AD. Those games contained not just physical competitions, but also contained a contest where a hymn to Apollo was sung, and so people competed to see who was the best doing that hymn. Another of the games was the Isthmian Games, which took place on the Isthmus of Corinth in honor of Poseidon. Those games started and ended around the same time period in history as the Pythian Games, so from around 582 BC and continuing to the 4th century AD. The Nemean Games, which took place in Nemea in honor of Zeus, were another of these Panhellenic Games. And yes, that's the same Nemea from the tales of Heracles or Hercules, depending on whether you're going to follow the Greek or Roman pronunciation, where he fought and slayed the Nemean lion. These games were from 573 BC or earlier, and also ran until around the 4th century AD. The final of the Panhellenic Games, of course, were the Olympic Games, which were held at Olympia and were also in honor of Zeus. These games started being celebrated in around 776 BC, so a couple hundred years prior to the other games mentioned, and ran until AD 393 under the Roman Emperor Theodosius I. Theodosius I, incidentally, was the last Roman emperor to rule over a combined East and Western Roman Empire, and when he died, one successor took over ruling the East, where the other one took over ruling in the West. He also spent a lot of his reign trying to consolidate Christian belief systems in his empire, and was a key driver behind making the Nicene Creed the orthodox belief system within Christianity. I mention this link to Christianity, as you might have noticed that all of the Panhellenic Games ended around the end of the 4th century AD. This is because with the rise of Christianity's popularity in the Roman Empire, and the various emperors like Theodosius I spending quite a bit of their energy trying to consolidate belief systems amongst the Roman populace, people practicing different religions and beliefs were discouraged. The Panhellenic Games were part of those efforts, as they were in essence pagan religious ceremonies and festivals, and so that was what caused the death knell for those 4 Panhellenic Games, and why they ended around the same time. Okay, now that we've covered a bunch of background and talked about where the Olympic Games fell within the wider Panhellenic Games, what specifically am I going to be building here in regards to the Olympic Games? Well, I'm going to be building the Stadium of Olympia, of course, where the events actually took place. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not going to recreate all of Olympia and all the religious buildings, of which there are quite a few. Rather, I'm going to be focusing on just the stadium where the actual sports events took place. If you want to see a recreation in Minecraft of some of the religious buildings and temples that were there, like the Temple of Zeus, which contained the statue of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, as well as the Temple of Hera at Olympia, I'm going to point you over to a cool episode that Daskalos did where he recreated them in his ancient Greek Skyblock series. I'll put a link to his channel in the description so you can check that out if you're interested. Anyway, one of the interesting things about the site of Olympia is that despite being such an important location in Greek culture and history, its location was lost for over 1,000 years. You see, once the Olympic Games ceased and with the rise of Christianity, Olympia fell into decline and people stopped traveling there. Over the following centuries, it was subjected to earthquakes and landslides and was never cleared, rebuilt, or repaired. These landslides covered this site and people forgot where it was located. It was only a few hundred years ago that its location was rediscovered, and more than 4 meters or 13 feet of silt and dirt had to be removed to uncover the site during its excavations. Okay, onto the stadium that I'm recreating here in Minecraft. Compared to our modern stadiums, or a Roman amphitheater, or even other buildings at Olympia, the stadium where the sports events took place was actually pretty humble. It was around 212 meters, or around 700 feet long, and around 30 to 35 meters, or around 100 to 115 feet wide. So basically, a very long and narrow stadium, not the oval ones like we have today, or like maybe, for instance, a Roman amphitheater. In the early years of the stadium, the surface of the track was covered with sand, but later, perhaps as more events were added over time, the track's surface was changed to hard-packed clay. So I'm representing that actually in the build here as terracotta blocks. Where the starting blocks were, all the contestants would line up at that one side of the stadium at a row of stone blocks placed into the ground that acted as the starting blocks. These blocks even contained 2 grooved lines in them indicating where the contestants were supposed to place their feet in a standing position, not the crouch position like you see Olympians do today when running. The running lanes were divided by a white line that would run down the length of the track like in the modern Olympic Games. So I'm using string to separate the different running lanes here in this build. However, unlike today where there is an oval track and the runner's track follows that oval shape, in the ancient games there were no curves. It was just one long straight track from start to finish. The contestants would start on the east side of the stadium and then someone would yell the equivalent of go in ancient Greek, or a trumpet would sound, sources vary on how this is described, and run towards the Temple of Zeus, which was on the western side of the stadium, with the race being around 192 meters, or 630 feet in length, with an area of around 10.5 meters, or around 35 feet, after the finish line for the contestants to stop after they crossed that finish line. If they fell down after finishing the race, they were disqualified. One source I read indicated that at the finishing line, there were wooden posts that separated each runner's lane, and that would help the judges see who won the race. So imagine you're a judge and you're kind of looking down that finishing line at the wooden posts. Remember, back in those days, they didn't have stopwatches or other ways to time the race, so you had to go off of what the judge visually saw alone. The runners were also divided up into different heats, so there's qualifying runs just like there is today, and so the winners of each qualifying run would then race in the final race. The stadium was built into the side of a small hill, so on the one long side, they had a natural ridge of a hill for people to sit on, and then on the other side of the stadium, an artificial ridge was constructed for people to sit on the opposite side. There were no seats or benches for people to sit on. Everyone sat on the grass to watch the games. The exception to that rule were the judges, which had a small constructed seating area along the one side for the judges to sit in while the contest continued. Later, after Greece became part of the Roman Empire, the Romans did construct some wooden bench seating along the side opposite the judges' seating area. At the western end, at the far side of the finishing line, there was a vaulted entrance where the contestants would enter into the stadium. Much of the same things that you would see modern Olympians do to get ready for their events was described by ancient sources as things the ancient Olympians did. So, for example, things like stretching, jumping up and down, or running in place to kind of work off some nerves and excitement before the race, and then taking deep breaths as the race neared its starting time. People are still people, and we all just live in different times, but how we approach different situations are oftentimes much the same. Okay, so let's talk about these events, because mostly up to this point, I've just spoken about the main single 192-meter race called the Stade. And that's how it started back in 776 BC, with just that one race. Over time, though, more races were added and others were sometimes removed. Let me pop up this list on the screen here, which I think does a good job of showing how many different changes there were over time, and then let me talk about some of these that I found the most interesting. So as I said, it all started with the single sprint event called the Stade. In 724 BC, another race was added called the Daskalos, which was a two-stage race. The runners would sprint down to the finishing line and then go around a pole that was at the end there and then sprint back to end the race where they started at the starting line. That must have been popular because in the very next Olympics, 4 years later, another race was added, this time a long-distance race called a Daskalos, where the contestants would run 20 or 24 laps or lengths up and down the stadium's tracks. Over the next 100 or so years, they added other non-running events like wrestling, boxing, a 4-horse chariot race, and a horse race. This is also the time period where they added the pentathlon, which combines 5 different events into one. There was a stayed sprint race, a javelin throw, a discus throw, and a long jump. And the long jump was done a little different. Contestants were able to hold small weights in their hands to help propel themselves further and farther as they jumped, and it contained 5 separate jumps, kind of like how the modern triple jump kind of combines 5 different jumps together into one big long jump. And then the end event of the pentathlon was always wrestling. In 632 BC, they started adding events for boys. In 520 BC, they added a hoplite race where contestants would run but wearing armor. So basically, they'd be wearing a helmet and the hoplite shield and potentially greaves. In other words, the armor covering your shin. But other Greek pottery shows it being run without greaves and just a helmet and shield. Now, up to this point, I haven't mentioned women. Depending on the ancient sources, some indicate that women weren't allowed to compete nor watch the games, with the possible exception of the priestesses of Demeter. Other ancient sources say that unmarried women could watch, but that any married women couldn't watch upon pain of death. Now, I did just mention that women were not allowed to compete in the Olympics, and that's generally the case, with the exception of being the owner of a chariot team, with one princess of Sparta reputedly winning in one year. It's also important to note that women had their own festival called the Panhellenic Games, named after the goddess Hera, where they would run a 152-meter or around 500-foot race. So it's kind of like a woman's version of the stayed race. Okay, back to the events. What did the contestants get if they won? Well, as I said, no gold, silver, or bronze medals. Instead, the victors were given an olive leaf crown. Also, if you were the winner of the Olympic Games, you were allowed to put up an idealized statue of yourself, and if you won 3 times, you were able to put up a portrait statue of your likeness. However, if you were caught cheating, you were required to pay to install a bronze statue to Zeus, and those lined the entrance that the contestants had to walk on their way in to compete, perhaps to act as a last-minute reminder to be fair and not cheat. It's been estimated that the cost of a bronze statue like that was equivalent to around 10 years of pay. Now, one of the most famous cheaters in the Olympics was none other than the Roman Emperor Nero himself. Nero was well known as an emperor who was narcissistic and who was often cruel and who abused their office. He decided that he wanted to compete in the Olympic Games himself, and so had the Games postponed 2 years after when they normally would be, so that it would coincide with a visit that he was making to Greece in AD 67. While there, he competed in the chariot race event. Recall from earlier in the episode, the chariot race was supposed to have 4 horses, but Nero had his chariot being pulled by 10 horses. But during that event, he fell out of his chariot and didn't finish the race, but still had the judges declare him the victor and winner of the race. After he died the following year, his successor declared those Olympic Games nullified and forced the judges who had all taken bribes to pay back all the money and then pay massive fines on top of it. Well, that wraps up this video. I hope you liked the episode all about the history of the ancient Olympics and the stadium at Olympia. Make sure you take the time to like the video if you liked it and subscribe and all that stuff. If you want to see more videos about builds from the ancient world or the classical era, please check those out here on my channel. Thanks, have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.